Good evening. If you're just joining us, we're going to wait another minute or so to allow other participants to log into Zoom and be ready to go. All right, I'm going to start with my brief remarks. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the People's Law School. Tonight we have an exciting presentation by attorney Steve Weston on fire and explosion cases. The People's Law School is brought to you by the Sinas Dramis Law Firm and the Michigan Association for Justice and our media sponsor, WLNS 6. A few notes. Next week, please make sure you join us for our final session of the season. The presentation will be by attorney Cynthia Heenan on your right to protest, which I think is pretty timely in 2020. My name is Jackie Dupler. I'm an associate attorney at the Sinas Dramis Law Firm based in Lansing, practicing primarily family law. The format for this evening is Mr. Weston will give a presentation for about an hour, and he's willing to have questions throughout. And to submit your questions, you can type them into the chat feature, and I will interrupt Steve and give him your questions. A little bit about our speaker. Steve earned his bachelor's degree from Western Michigan University and his Juris Doctorate from University of Toledo College of Law. He is an attorney at the Sinas Dramis Law Firm based in the Kalamazoo office. His practice area includes personal injury, auto accidents, traumatic brain injuries, burn injuries, including those related to defective products and unsafe premises. Excuse me. Oh, my notes. Okay, here we go. All right. Steve has written and been published in multiple publications, including on the hidden and explosive dangers of electronic cigarettes and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD should no longer be considered as only a mental disorder. He has received many awards throughout his career, including an award from the Best Lawyers in America, Kalamazoo Lawyer of the Year for Personal Injury Plaintiffs by Best Lawyers, Michigan Super Lawyer, AV Peer Review Rated, and Lifetime Achievement Award from the Disability Network of Southwest Michigan. He is involved in many aspects in many professional organizations, including he is a member of the Association of Trial Lawyers of America, advisor to Board of Directors of the Great Lakes Burn Camp, past special member of the American Association of Neuropsychology, past president, Board of Directors of the Disability Network of Southwest Michigan, special member of the American Burn Association, and member of the Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors. So from afar, if you guys can all give a warm welcome to Mr. Weston.
Thank you, Jackie. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give a little bit of a talk tonight about something that is catastrophic, sad, and most of the time unnecessary, and that is fire and explosion cases. When we talk about fire and explosion cases, what we're talking about are people who suffer horrible burn or traumatic brain injuries as a result of an explosion, typically, but not always, at their home. And these are almost universally avoidable when certain safety steps are followed. And so because I have represented many injured folks who suffered physical injuries, brain injuries, burn injuries in these fire and explosion cases, I thought it would make sense to shed a little bit of light on how it is that these things happen and what safety rules are in place that try to prevent it. I first got involved with fire and explosion cases years and years, decades ago, actually. For over 35 years, we have represented burn injury survivors and traumatic brain injury survivors. And as we became more known across the country for that, we started getting people referred to us from Michigan and elsewhere who have been seriously injured in these kinds of fires and explosions. And typically we get those referrals from folks that are treating those people, medical people. And the reason that they send those folks to us is because we've established a way and a system to take care of not only the legal X's and O's, but also to take care of the person and the person's family, because these are so difficult of cases to recover from emotionally and physically. According to the U.S. Fire Administration, there are hundreds and hundreds of fire and home explosion cases every year resulting from gasoline vapors or LP gas systems or 20-pound LP gas tanks, the kind that you use at your grill. And many, many people are burned and die from these unnecessary explosions. Propane is in particular in a high percentage of the cause for these home explosions, and that is because of its widespread use. Most people, many people in rural areas have not had the benefit of natural gas lines being run through their neighborhoods or their streets, and so they are forced to use typically 500-gallon LP gas tanks on their property that supply the energy needs to heat their home and cook and use their dryers and everything else. Propane is something that is refined from either raw crude oil or from raw natural gas. It doesn't occur naturally, it has to be refined. It is stored as a liquid, and it is kept as a liquid by being put under pressure. The difference about propane that is different than many other gases is that while water, for example, boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit before it then becomes a gas, propane is a liquid at 50 below zero Fahrenheit, and it boils at minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. When it becomes a gas, when it boils, it expands at a ratio of 270 to 1. So 1 unit of liquefied petroleum gas, LP gas, will expand to 270 times that size when it becomes a gas. So a small amount of a leak can result in a large amount of gas being released. Typically, gasoline fires, propane fires, and explosions occur as a result of either a leak in a pipeline, an appliance, or a faulty installation, or through ignition of flammable vapors as a result of the vapors coming into contact with a competent ignition source, such as a spark, friction, heat, electrical charge, even such as when you turn on a light switch, can cause a propane air mix or a gasoline vapor air mix that is within what we call the upper and lower explosive limits to ignite and explode and create a fire. Typically, these gasoline fume fires and LP gas fires, if able to, will go back to the source of the fuel and create an even larger fire and explosion. there are a variety of, in fact, multiple. It's almost astonishing how many different safety standards, codes, and laws have been enacted, followed, and put into place in order to ensure the safety of folks who are using propane LP gas products. For example, there's something called NFPA 58. That's the National Fire Protection Association code 58, called the Liquefied Petroleum Gas Code. There is the NFPA 54, which is called the National Fuel Gas Code. There is the International Fire Code, and there's the Michigan Residential Code, and the International and State Building Codes, which all have an interreference with each other in various capacities and set forth very, very stringent standards for the installation, building, maintenance, testing, and use and delivery of LP gas. There are some common and key provisions amongst these standards. For example, the building codes and other codes require that folks who install appliances or devices that utilize LP gas follow the manufacturer's instructions with regard to putting these things in service. That goes to the materials used, assembly process, and locations in the home, and how to vent it properly. There are requirements requiring the odorization of LP and natural gas, which in their natural state are odorless and colorless and non-detectable to the human nose. So they require the use typically of something called mercaptan, which gives it that rotten egg smell so that we people can smell if there's an escape of natural or propane gas. The problem with that standard is that the odorization can be negated if the pipelines carrying the gas are buried completely or even partially in soil or sand, because the soil dissipates the odorization below the level that humans can pick up on it. The other thing is that if there's a small or a persistent natural gas or propane leak in the home, something called olfactory fatigue can occur. That's where we smell something so many times, so frequently for so long, our brain glosses over the smell and we don't know that we're smelling it. The codes also require that pressure testing be done, that leak testing be done, which are not the same, and when those things have to be done. For example, if you have a new service, if you have an out of service situation, if you have an out of gas situation in your tank and you need it refilled, any kind of an interruption of service requires both pressure testing, leak testing, and a visual inspection of the gas pipelines that are accessible for the condition of that pipeline, as well as an inspection of the fittings, the seals at the connection points of the pipelines and appliances. So anytime you're changing from natural gas to LP gas or vice versa, anytime you are keeping LP gas service, but you're changing the provider, there has to be both a pressure test and a leak test. And we'll come back to the difference between those two tests, because even among folks who work in the industry, there's a high level of confusion between pressure testing and leak testing. And many, many workers in this industry, those who deliver this stuff to your house, think that doing a pressure test is the same as doing a leak test, and it's not true. The codes require very specific and standardized training of employees who are transporting, transferring, filling, delivering LP gas into your system, who do maintenance, who do inspections, The whole A through Z is very, very standardized for specific training that's required, and it has to be documented by the gas company, and it has to be regularly repeated so that the employee will know and the employer will know that everybody's following proper safety protocols. Let me give you an example of some real life cases that I've worked on and explain how these different tragedies occurred. One case that we went to trial on years and years ago involved a family who was moving to Michigan from Indiana because the father slash husband got a job working for a pig farm in Michigan. And he was given a house that he rented from the owners of the house who owned the pig farm. And the very first night the family was in the home, there was an explosion, and all four members of the family, mom, dad, and two little boys, were killed in the explosion. And when we did our investigation, we were able to determine that there was a leak at the connection point of an old unused LP gas dryer that was down in the basement of this place. The lines were rusty, it wasn't properly connected, and no one ever did a leak test or a pressure test before putting all this back into service after they moved into this home. Another example is a case where a propane company went to a family's home in order to put a temporary amount of propane, LP gas, liquefied propane gas into their 500-gallon tank outside. And the employee, instead of conducting a pressure test and a leak test, actually told the homeowner that such tests did not need to be done, even though this system had been shut down and out of service for an extended period of time prior to that day. The result of that was that there was a leak, there was an escape of LP gas into the family's basement. And when father and his young son went down to the basement to utilize a dryer, there was a spark and an explosion and catastrophic damages to both father and son, including traumatic brain injuries and burn injuries, both of whom also have been subsequently diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet another case happened down in North Carolina, a case that we did, in which a woman rented a small cinder block home from the landlord. She had asked that they repaint inside the home to make it a little fresher for her and her children. She was in doing some cleaning, and there was an explosion that eventually we were able to determine was an uncapped gas line at a place where the folks who were doing the servicing of the home took off a wall-mounted heater and never capped the gas line farther upstream. And so there was a small gas leak coming through constantly. And when somebody lit up a cigarette, the whole house exploded. This young woman was thrown through a cinder block wall and suffered horrible, horrible catastrophic injuries. Another kind of case happened again years and years ago, and we're still in contact with this. She was 4.5 years old at the time, and I'm still working with her today, now that she's in her 20s. This was a case where grandfather and little girl goes with grandfather to do some errands. They first stop at a propane filling station to have their grill propane tank refilled. The folks that refilled it should not have, because the tank was dented and damaged, first of all. Second of all, it was overfilled. And thirdly, the employees placed it in the trunk of grandpa's car on its side rather than upright. As a result, the overflow protection device didn't work. And when they stopped at Myers, went in to get some things, came back out, Grandpa puts the little girl in the car seat in the back seat, ignites the ignition, and the entire interior of the car explodes and is on fire. And this little girl suffered 80% total body surface burns and a variety of psycho-emotional problems that are still plaguing her today. So those are just a few of the kinds of examples of cases that we've actually worked on that happen far too frequently across our country and including in Michigan. So part of the issue that we wanted to speak about tonight, after setting up the background for the incidents of these explosions and how they occur, is to give some education as to what you have to do after a fire or explosion. God forbid anyone should experience that. The first and most obvious thing is to get immediate medical help and to make sure that anyone who's injured, burned, or otherwise injured in the explosion or the falling rubble of the home is getting the immediate, short-term, and then long-term help medically and psychologically that they are going to need. The next step is
Steve,
that
Steve, sorry, I have a question on that. In terms of burns, is that something that all hospitals throughout the state are equally qualified to address burns? Or are there certain facilities that maybe specialize in that practice?
No, that's a very good question. In Michigan, and things have changed a little through the accreditation process of hospitals and burn units over the years. And it's become very expensive for hospitals to maintain full-fledged burn unit accreditation. But in Michigan, we've got Spectrum Health. Bronson Hospital has a trauma burn center. And then there's the University of Michigan Trauma Burn Center. Those are the preeminent ones in Michigan. In North Carolina, there are several, but probably the most advanced is University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Medical Center, Trauma Burn Center. And most states have one or two typically top grade accredited burn centers. And it's really important that, as inconvenient as it is, that your loved one or yourself goes to the best burn center available, because the long-term recovery and the question of whether you recover from a burn is going to depend in large part on the first weeks of treatment that you obtain, because of the level of complications that come with burn injuries, everywhere from infection to dehydration to anoxia as a result of either an inhalation injury or as a result of organ damage, not being able to properly keep the blood chemistry where it's supposed to be and oxygenate the body properly. So that's a great question. It's important that you go to an actual burn center as opposed to your local hospital. Most local hospitals who are not equipped realize they're not equipped, and they will end up either sending you via ambulance or life flight helicopter to an actual burn unit. If there is unfortunately an explosion and fire, it's important, after you get the medical aspect stabilized, it's really important that we get in there very, very quickly and preserve, collect, and document the physical evidence. This is a very complex procedure. There are standards called NFPA 921, which set forth peer-reviewed, accepted, certified standards for how to conduct what's called an origin and cause fire investigation. And it gets very complicated very quickly. the best advice I can give you is that you're going to need someone who can guide this process, and that you're going to need an attorney who is experienced in handling explosion and fire cases. It's got a lot of its own terminology. There's a lot of its own science, and it's very hard to keep up on the codes and the standard of care for attorneys who are dabbling in a little of this, a little of that, and they might have done your will last year, but that doesn't mean they know what they're doing with a fire explosion case. So if you're going to talk to a lawyer about representing you or a loved one, it's very important that you ask them about their experience and the outcomes that they've enjoyed or not in representing clients in these cases, as well as what is their approach to the human being that they're representing in terms of providing the legal support and facilitating the kind of medical care, therapies, treatments, psychological care, counseling, and the needs of the family who have never experienced having a loved one so seriously injured either. The most important thing is to collect, preserve, and document the physical evidence, because down the road there will be testing on the systems involved, the appliances, the gas pipelines, A through Z, to determine part of the process of what went wrong. What was the origin of the fire? That is, where did it originate? And what was the cause of the fire in terms of, was it a leak? Was it just somebody dropped a match in a wastebasket, or what? And in the process of doing this investigation, it's really important that we don't have what's called spoliation. That's a legal, silly way of saying spoiling the evidence. And it's very, very important that the attorney is able to be the referee and the ringmaster to communicate and organize a multi-party origin and cause investigation according to pre-agreed upon protocols, which sets forth the procedure and the steps, the order of the steps, who's going to do what, who's going to maintain and hold the evidence, and whether there's going to be any what we call destructive testing or non-destructive testing, and when. Typically, the first thing that's done is to obtain and extract from the rubble of a home explosion all the gas piping system in its entirety, which requires a lot of physical work, excavation, digging. It's almost like the archaeologists who are looking for ancient trinkets in the rock, in the sand. They have to be careful how they go about extracting it in order to avoid altering it, changing it, or ruining the evidence so that later testing cannot be competently done. That requires that you're going to have every party that's involved. It'll be the homeowner insurance company, it'll be the gas company, it'll be the homeowner himself or herself, it will be anyone else who was in the supply line or in the maintenance efforts for the appliances and or gas lines at this home. Have to all be given an opportunity to bring their own experts and have their own input as to the protocols and how it's going to be done and when it's going to be done, but it must get done quickly. You want to get this origin and cause investigation done as soon as possible, humanly possible, which means that the attorney involved hopefully has ready access to one or more companies, and there are engineering and safety engineering companies all around the country, multiple of them just in Michigan, that do this kind of work, and they know they have to be ready like a fireman to go at a moment's notice, and that's what they do because they have to do that. So that's a really important thing, and also depending on the nature of the fire and explosion cause and origin investigation, multiple experts, fields of expertise end up becoming involved. We have materials science and metallurgy engineering. We have fire investigators. We have folks who specialize in doing soil analysis, which is important to determine whether the mercaptan, the odorant, was broken down or whether the soil was particularly solvent that led to a quicker than expected deterioration of piping. We need folks who do professional engineering. We need construction standards experts, because many of these systems may have been installed improperly. There's going to need to be biomechanical engineers in many cases, as well as medical experts, because one of the things that I alluded to earlier is folks may have a serious burn injury, and then we find out down the road as they become stable in their burn treatment that they've suffered an acquired brain injury, typically as a result of either the trauma to the internal organs and or because of what we call an inhalation injury, where the lungs are damaged and cannot transfer oxygen readily enough. That then leads to anoxia and brain damage. And many, many folks who suffer serious burns also have that. We also have had multiple clients who were involved in an explosion, and not unlike our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan who were in the blast radius of an IED, for example, the concussive forces of an explosion can cause traumatic brain injury as well. And so that's something that needs to be assessed early on, so that the people can, the folks who need to treat this person can be assembled into a team that is going to take care of all of the needs of this person, not just patch up the burns.
Steve,
So,
Steve, we have another question here. I'm sorry. It says,
sure, no, that's fine.
in car explosions, are similar procedures and testing done? And the question was from about 2 minutes or so.
Yes, they have. It's virtually the same process. It's just involving a different instrumentality, if you will. Instead of doing it in a big home with, hundreds and hundreds of feet of pipes, we do a origin and cause investigation within the vehicle, interior, exterior, and underneath. We will bring in engineers and auto engineers who are familiar with the way these things are supposed to work and familiar with finding evidence that something failed, or in the event of the example I told you with a propane explosion from a 20-pound cylinder, they can, origin and cause folks can find out where the fire and the blast originated within the vehicle, and then they can see fire patterns, and then they can do testing on the 20-pound cylinder. And what we also know is that when a cylinder is on its side, the leak prevention attributes of the gauge of the valve that's on the top of the tank is unable to work properly. And so it allows a small leakage of liquefied propane. And as again, I said that when the liquefied propane comes out and it boils at minus 44 degrees, it's almost never minus 44 degrees, even in Michigan. So it's going to immediately vaporize into 270 times the amount of LP gas that leaked as a liquid. So yes, they do that, and the same processes and procedures are applicable, as well as many of the same code sections. So there are some basic things that are very important with regard to what can you do to try to put together some protections for you and the folks at your home when it comes to gasoline vapor explosions and fires. One example I forgot to give was a gasoline vapor case. Was a young boy who was 2 years old, 2.5 years old, over on the east side of Michigan. His parents lived in a townhouse, which had an upstairs with bedrooms, a main floor, and then a little small basement area. And in the basement area was the water heater, the furnace, and all the storage areas for things like household goods, paint, and that's where he kept his lawnmower, which had access to the outdoors through a walkout, and kept his gasoline there because they didn't have a garage. So little boy goes in and he's reaching for something that looked fun and attractive to him. And he kicks over the plastic can of gasoline, which spilled out onto the basement floor. As soon as gasoline is in open air, it's going to vaporize. The vapors are flammable. In fact, usually it's not the gasoline liquid that ignites, it's the vapors. And in this case, the family had a water heater in the basement that had a air intake for the pilot light down at the bottom of the water heater tank. Many folks still have those kinds of things. And what happened was the intake of the water heater drew in the flammable gasoline vapors, ignited them, and caused a huge explosion and fire. This little boy was a miracle boy. He had over 95% total body surface burns, horribly disfigured, and he's actually doing pretty well today. We brought a claim against the water heater manufacturer on the theory that it was well known within the industry that paint vapors, turpentine, paint thinners, gasoline, kerosene, all of these things create flammable vapors. They know that people store things in close proximity, and that typically the height or the how far up in the air vapors go is usually no more than 12 inches. So our claim was you should never have had the air intake for the pilot on this water tank lower than 12 inches. You should have either put the whole tank up on a stand, which were commercially available, or redesign the thing so it has a snorkel air intake where it takes air from the top of the tank and snorkels it down to wherever the enclosed instead of open pilot light was. And we were very successful in that case. But that's a common event too, especially in warmer states like Florida and other states that don't necessarily have a lot of basements or large storage capacities. Typically, to save interior space, these contractors design these homes that they put the furnace and the water heater out in the garage, which, unless it's done properly on an elevated basis, you're asking for a ton of trouble because of the natural vapors that come off of your vehicles and other things that you're doing in the garage. So unfortunately, we've had far too many of those cases as well. The long-term process for folks who survive these explosions and fires is very, very involved. And it's important for the attorney to be sure that the proper burn treatment team is assembled and keeps up with what they're doing and brings in the therapy and the treatments needed. And that ranges everywhere from burn doctors to orthopedic care because of the concussive effects of explosion or falling debris, physiatry to manage the recovery rehabilitation process, occupational therapy, physical therapy, psychiatry, psychology. Many of these people thought they were going to die when this happened. Many of them are trapped for a period of time in the wreckage. And a good percentage of these folks suffer from serious, severe PTSD that in and of itself can destroy their future life. And that needs to be treated by appropriate help right off the bat as well. So what can we do to try to protect your family a little bit at least? Well, one thing to do is that if you change service providers for your LP gas, if you have a gas water heater installed in your home, make sure that there are no liquids stored anywhere near the water heater that can emit flammable vapors that can be introduced to the pilot light of the appliance. And that goes with not just water heaters, but also gas dryers and washers. If you change service providers, if you are out of service for repair, if you are out of gas and you call them to say we're out of gas according to our gauges, anytime that there's a brief or lengthy, but even a brief interruption of service, anytime that main service valve is turned off on the 500-gallon tank and turned back on within even a minute, that's an out of service, interruption of service. And before it can be placed back operational, there must be both a leak test and a pressure test. You can be sure that your home, that somebody is present, that they're asking and insisting upon seeing both a leak test and a pressure test conducted and having the results of those tests written down and documented. Many providers, service providers, have employees, and some of the owners believe that a pressure test is just as good as a leak test. They believe that if there's a leak, then the pressure is going to drop. The problem is the way that each of these tests are conducted is different. So, for example, with a pressure test, we're testing some things that don't necessarily include leaking. When you have a 500-gallon tank sitting in your yard, the tank is under immense pressure. The LP gas inside is under immense pressure. So you have what's called a first stage regulator that steps down that pressure to somewhere usually between 10 and 15 PSI. Then it goes into the pipe further toward the home, and it goes to the second stage regulator. Gas appliances cannot use 10 to 15 PSI to operate. None of them are equipped or designed for that. So what the second stage regulator does is to step down the pressure even further so that it's measured in inches of water, which is a small amount of pressure, very small amount of pressure. And so when you're doing a pressure test, what happens is the main service valve is left open from the tank, and air or nitrogen are inserted through, and we want to test to see whether both of the first and second stage regulators are working and whether they're stepping it down as they're supposed to. Excuse me. And in order to do that, the valve is left open and the appliances are disconnected from the gas lines, either capped or with a proper spigot turned off, so that if there's a leak, it's not different than having a bucket with water in it and a hose, and the hose is hooked up to a valve in the bucket of water. If you have a hole at the bottom of the bucket, the valve's going to turn on and demand more water come in, more pressure, and it's going to maintain a constant pressure, a constant level of water, if you will, in the bucket, even though it's leaking out the bottom. With a leak test, you pressurize the lines from the outside beginning of the service line. Then you close the service valve, and then you measure over a period of time that's required whether there's any decrease in pressure, and you do not have the ability to recharge the system. So if there's any leak, you're going to detect it. We've had cases where inspections were not done, holes were found in copper gas tubing, that they did a pressure test, but they did not do a leak test. And so nobody knew there was a hole. And as a result, the whole home exploded. So make sure that you insist that both a pressure test and a leak test are done. Ask them, do they know how to do it? How many have they done? And be sure that it's documented. One thing that you can do is to also be sure to have carbon monoxide and natural gas and propane gas detectors in your home properly spaced. If you smell gas or those alarms go off, don't go try to figure out what's what or how to fix it. Just get out of the house, call the service provider and 911, excuse me, and go wait at wherever you can nearby that's safe but is out of the home. Don't try to save or rescue anything or any pet. Just get out, because some people say that we want to open windows, and in many instances that's the worst thing you can do, because there's a flammable range, an explosive range for natural and propane gases. And that means you have to have just the right mixture of oxygen and fuel vapor to create a explosive mixture in the right percentages. And if the amount of air is not high enough at the source of the leak, and there's no ignition source that has triggered any kind of an ignition, the propane or natural gas may not ignite at all until you introduce enough air to create that explosive mix. So don't try to figure it out. Just get out of the house. A couple of clients that we've had recently have shown me that one thing also to do, which has really nothing directly to do with your safety, but it has to do with your recovery financially, and that is to be sure that you regularly meet with your insurance agent and be sure that you have enough property homeowners insurance to be able to rebuild your home if, God forbid, something should happen. We have had cases that have happened in the last year. They had homeowners policies that would rebuild their home up to a certain amount. And prior to COVID, it was plenty. But since COVID has hit, the lack of supply of building supplies, people to build things with those building supplies, the costs of lumber, material, labor, A to Z has gone up well over 300%. So if you have a house that you think you can rebuild for $300,000, for example, or $200,000 a year ago, you're going to be about more than half to 2/3 short if something, God forbid, were to happen now and for the immediate foreseeable future. So that's just something practical, because to see the heartbreak of these folks that we represent, and there's really nothing we can do. They purchased a certain coverage. They were given that coverage. We can't go tell the insurance company you have to give these people free money because they're getting screwed on this deal, because that's not what the contract says. So I'd be happy to answer any kind of questions that anyone has. That's sort of the long and short of it. We'll go from there.
Steve, a couple questions were sent to me directly. One, I think you touched on a little bit, but how did you get involved in this kind of niche practice within personal injury?
Well, going back 33 years, we've been involved with the burn community. We've been involved with representing burn survivors, and we've represented traumatic brain injury survivors. And unfortunately, the incidence of these home explosions and fires happen far too frequently. So we started representing individuals who suffered their burn injuries as a result of a home explosion and fire. And as a result of that, we had to come up to speed, learn all about the science, learn about the codes, learn about the processes to properly investigate and represent these folks in these cases. And once you start doing something a lot of people say, well, those guys do that. And so that creates sort of a critical mass or gravitational pull or whatever you want to describe it as, that more people then call us because we've got a long history of doing this stuff. And it's very rewarding to help people who are literally not just the injured folks, but their family members at the lowest of low points that they've ever seen. And it's really rewarding to be able to help those folks move forward and regain hope in their life, even though their life is going to be different.
Thank you. I have a couple other questions. It says, do you recommend homeowners take pictures of before and after any explosion when you are allowed to be on site? And then that same question about for vehicle explosions.
That's a really, really good question. It is a great idea to, everybody's got smartphones, it seems like. Take your smartphone and put it on video and video every room in your home, everything that's in it, all of your, if you've got jewelry, video that, which by the way, you should get insurance for separately. Video your whole property, inside, outside, each room, everything down to the light fixtures, the curtains, any kind of ceiling special stuff that you have. Video all of that as soon as you can. And if you make significant changes, do it again and keep that stored on a flash drive or someplace, preferably where it's not going to burn up if there is an explosion and fire. It is also perfectly fine to take photos or recordings of your home after an explosion, but you should not do that yourself because those sites are inherently dangerous, unstable, and people can and do get injured trying to go through a home site after an explosion has occurred, because you don't know what's weak, what's going to give way, what's been charred past being able to support your weight. And there's a lot of sharp things that get created in these explosions. So what you want to do is be sure you've got an attorney that brings in the experts. I'm here to tell you, I haven't seen a house fire or a house explosion case in 35 years that there weren't at least 1,000 photographs taken by experts after the fact. They will cover that detail for you. But if you want to be able to show your insurance company, here's what we lost, that's the best way to do it.
Okay, don't be shy. You guys have a little bit more time to ask questions. Oh, we have another one. Should you hire your own investigator or will your insurance company send one? And if your insurance company does send one, will they really act in your best interest?
The answer is a investigator should be hired who's dedicated solely to your interests. Insurance companies have a much more limited interest in hiring these investigators. Your homeowner's carrier, for example, their interest is that if they just had to write a check for $250,000 to rebuild your house and additional monies to put you up at a hotel or an apartment while that's happening, they want to get their money back. And so they will hire someone to come out and do origin and cause, but they're not there to do the same thing that your own investigator is there to do. That he's there to do origin and cause, but you also want to have that guided by your lawyer, who is able to add a dimension to information that we want to pick up early on during this process that can be used later to help explain the extent and nature of the family's loss. So they will hire one, but they're taking care of them, and you want to take care of you. But you also don't want to go out and just hire anybody who says, I do fire investigations, because it's like everything else, from cooks to drivers to lawyers to doctors. There's okay, there's great, there's outstanding, and then there's not so much. So you want to know who, unless you know who's good, you want to leave that to your attorney if you have a good experienced attorney.
Steve, I worry that you may have been so thorough that we don't have as many questions as we would normally. And I apologize to everyone for my puppy barking in the back.
Steve, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Have you had clients whose insurance company maybe has falsely accused them of arson and maybe will refuse to pay them? And then what does a person do from there?
We had a case that there was some early talk of that, but after the origin and cause investigation was done, it was pretty clear that there was no arson involved. But that does happen on a regular basis, especially for small business owners who weren't making quite as much money as they were hoping, and all of a sudden their property burns down. That happens a fair amount of time, where the insurance company says, you burned this place down, we're not paying. And in that event, it's necessary, if you've got evidence that they're wrong, and assuming that they are wrong, that you bring a lawsuit against them for breach of contract. And much of the same fire investigation techniques and information is followed and obtained in that scenario. It's just, hopefully in that scenario there were no injuries, and so it's just going to be property damage issues.
All right, Steve, I think that we've answered all of the questions. I want to thank you again for presenting tonight. I think it was a very informative presentation, and I apologize, we all learned a lot tonight. So thank you again, Steve. Thank you to all of our participants, and we hope to see all of you back next week for this, our final presentation, that being your right to protest. Everyone have a great night. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jackie.